You guys doing all right today? You guys pumped for baptisms, maybe? Yeah, okay, good. I am too. I'm glad to see all you guys here. And I want to welcome you, especially if you're new with us. We're thankful that you're here. I'm Carter. I'm one of the pastors here at Redemption Church. I'm really honored that everybody's here, whether you're joining us here in person or whether you're joining us online. I'm so thankful for each and every single one of you guys. We're going to be back in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47 today. If you want to turn there or find it on your device, we'll also be in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 through 25. If you want to stick a finger there, if you're on your device, you'll just have to switch real quick, okay? Because technology isn't caught up that much yet, okay? So maybe having the actual printed version is a little bit better sometimes. In this case, it will be, because we're going to go to both of those. But last week, we started a new series called Grow, the Secret to Spiritual Maturity. And we talked about 5 practices that are going to help us grow in spiritual maturity: gospel, gather, groups, give, and go. We have this handout for you on your seats there. If you didn't get one last week or you weren't here, you can take this with you. There are also these little gospel prayers that we have for you. If they're not on your seats today, I think they're out in the lobby, so you can grab one on your way out. It's to help you pray through the gospel. But we gave all that to you last week, and I gave the secret right up front. It wasn't just clickbait to say it's the secret to spiritual maturity, okay? It wasn't clickbait. I just gave it to you right up front because I don't want to just drag it out and string you along. And the secret is, if you ever hope to grow in spiritual maturity, you first have to believe in what Jesus has done for you. That's the secret. You have to grow deeper down into the gospel. That was it. The gospel is not just a list of do's and don'ts that you have to accomplish to please God. It's first and foremost an announcement. It's good news about what Jesus has already accomplished for you. It's a deep knowledge of your own need. Yeah, it's a deep knowledge of your own rebellion and your own rejection of God and your own evil heart, for sure. But it's an even deeper knowledge of the love that God has for you and what he's done on your behalf. Not in spite of you being a sinner, but because you were a sinner. Now, I was reading the Psalms this week in my own personal time, came across David writing this. He said, "Lord, for the sake of your name, forgive my iniquity, for it is immense." It's from Psalm 25. He's praying, and he's not just saying, "God, please forgive me, in spite of my offense. Forgive me though my sin is immense." He doesn't say that. He says, "Forgive me for my sin is immense." It's huge. I know it's huge. I need your forgiveness. That's incredible that we have a God that we can go to because we're sinful, not one we have to hide from because we're sinful. He's ready and he's willing to forgive us. And he proved it by sending Jesus into the world to die in our place. So the Christian life is learning that truth about the gospel and swimming deeper and deeper down into the depths of God's love for us. And therefore, last week we also said the gospel isn't the diving board that just gets you into the Christian life. It's not the diving board. A lot of people think that it's the way that you get in. You got to believe this gospel. It's the ABCs. No. It's the A through Z. It's not just the diving board. It's the whole pool we're supposed to swim in. We have to go deeper and deeper down into God's love and grow more mature in knowing the depth of our sin, but the depth of his love for us. And that's the beauty of the gospel. You can't do things for God if you don't understand what he's first done for you. That's the whole deal. But then once you do believe that and you respond to that love, then you can begin to do some things like the 5 practices that we've laid out here. It's what you do in response to God's love for you. It's our motivation. Our motivation gets changed. And it's no longer guilt or shame or religious duty or something like that. It's the heat that transforms and shapes us that we talked about last week. That's his love in us. It transforms us, and then we respond. And that response, that overflow of the love that we have for God in response to his love for us, is what enables us to then begin to practice some stuff, like these 5 things that we've laid out. So that's a quick review of last week. If you weren't here, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to it as well. But we were talking about the gospel last week. That's the first G. Today, we're going to talk about the second one, gathering. Right? Gospel gathered. So if you want to grow in spiritual maturity, then we must gather with other believers. That's our main point for today. If you're taking notes, you like to write things down, you're welcome to write that down. We must gather with other believers. Now, maybe when you hear me say that, you immediately think of some things, okay? Maybe you hear that and you go, okay, here we go again. It's another pastor telling me what I ought to be doing on a Sunday. It's another pastor telling me I need to gather. He's trying to gather a crowd. He's trying to do it for himself and put on a show, and it's a big deal, and he just wants to get a lot of people here. If that's what you're hearing, that might be you. I don't know what baggage you have. Maybe you feel that way when you hear me say that about gathering. Or maybe you think, well, Nature is my church. I can have church by myself. I don't need to get with other people. I can just be me and God. You know, that's what church is to me. So you don't feel like gathering with other Christians is maybe a necessity for you. You can have a personal relationship with God. It doesn't need to involve other people. Maybe that's where you're at. Or maybe you just don't have strong feelings either way. You know, maybe you could take it or leave it. Maybe I'll go to church today. Maybe I won't. It's just whatever I feel like. It doesn't really matter to me, you know. Maybe that's where you're at. Maybe you're just indifferent, we might call it. Or I'll give you one more, okay? Maybe you're on the total opposite extreme. And you're like, of course I go to church. I'm a Christian. I go to church every Sunday. I'm a good Christian. That's what good Christians do. We go to church every Sunday because we should. We ought to. We have to. So you go to church to check that religious box for yourself so that you'll feel good about yourself, or you have a sense of duty or a sense of maybe even self-righteousness because you're a part of a religion. It's more about the religion for you than it is about the relationship either with God or with other people. And in all of these cases, and probably more that we could mention, man, these are just wrong ways to think about the gathering. Because when you become a Christian and you get the gospel, like we talked about last week, and you experience God's love in your heart, and you enter into God's family, it becomes part of your identity now. And you're a part of the church, what we call the church. So gathering with the family just becomes a part of the deal for you. That's what it looks like. It's kind of like being a baseball player, okay? If you think about baseball, you can become a baseball player, and the only way that you can actually play baseball is what? It's on a team, right? You can't play baseball if you're not on a team. That's just how it works. Now, maybe you can go play catch. Maybe you can enjoy playing pickup games of baseball in the park or something like that. But unless you're on a team, you can't consider yourself an actual baseball player. To be a player, fundamental to that, inherent within that, is that you're on a team. It's a team sport. That's exactly what it's like to be in the Christian life. It's a team sport. It's fundamental. It's an inherent part of being a follower of Jesus that you're automatically in the community of believers. You can't get around that. And so, being that way, we assemble together in both formal and informal ways. That's just a part of it, is gathering together. Assembling with other believers is such an important part of what it looks like to follow Jesus. Hebrew 10 will actually tell us as we get into it today, the only way that you'll be able to grow in spiritual maturity is if you gather with other believers. It's that important. Yeah, you need time alone with God. We talked about that last week. Meditation, prayer, scripture, all of that kind of stuff. But without other believers in your life to actually start to apply that knowledge that you have about Jesus and about the gospel, it kind of renders it useless. You can spend all day in the Bible and gain a bunch of knowledge about what Jesus has done for you until you actually start to live it out in the lab of the church. It's not going to mean very much. You've got to actually be around other believers in order to continue to grow in spiritual maturity. And we see that play out in the texts, both of them today. So let's go ahead and start this. Let's reread Acts chapter 2 like we started last week. We'll remind ourselves of these 5 growth practices. And then we'll jump to Hebrews and focus on the gathering specifically. But this is what Acts chapter 2, verse 42 says. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe. Many wonders and signs were being performed through the apostles. And now all the believers were together, and they held all things in common. And they sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. And every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and broke bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. Every day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Now, remember, this is right after Peter's famous sermon where he goes and he preaches to all the people in Jerusalem, and people are getting saved by the thousands. And it's describing in a nutshell the new life of a follower of Jesus. That's what this whole section is doing now that people have responded to Peter's sermon and they've become followers. This is what it looks like to live as a follower. And we summed it up in these 5 practices: gospel, gather, groups, give, and go. Now we see them devoting themselves to the teaching of the apostles. That's the gospel. They devoted themselves to the teaching of the gospel. They gathered in the temple and throughout homes throughout the week, right? And then they gave to those in need. And then they went to the nations with the gospel because the Lord added to their number day by day. And how can they believe if they don't hear? And how can they hear if somebody doesn't preach or go to them with the gospel? So we see all 5 of these G's right here in this text. Specifically, though, on gathering now. In verse 42, it says they devoted themselves to the teaching of the gospel in these gatherings, right? to fellowship, which is intentional relationships, authentic community is what we call it here. It's one of our core values. To the breaking of bread, which a lot of translations will just render communion or the Lord's Supper. It's a reference to that symbolic gesture of taking communion together. And then it says also prayer here, which is corporate. But then verse 46, it says they devoted themselves to meeting where? In the temple on a daily basis, which is a larger, more formal gathering. The temple was a bigger space. More people were present, as well as meeting together throughout the week in homes of people, right? That's more informal. They're doing life together, we might say. So even here in Acts chapter 2, we're starting to see this larger, more formal kind of gathering begin to take shape. And we're going to talk more about the informal community next week when we get into groups. That's the next G. And we'll talk about that. But today, let's focus on these bigger gatherings that are more formal, it seems like here. This is how the early church would gather more formally. And so it's going to inform how we gather more formally, like what we're doing today, this morning. And there's no clearer place for that than Hebrews 10. So let's turn there and let's read starting in verse 19. This is what it says. It'll be up on the screens if you need it. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have boldness to enter the sanctuary through the blood of Jesus, he has inaugurated for us a new and living way through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. Man, this is just like some beautiful Old Testament temple allusions here to help us show that Jesus has brought us near to God, right? He is the greater temple. He has torn the curtain into all of that. Verse 21, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed in pure water. Let us hold on to the confession of our hope without wavering, since he who promised is faithful. Now, we haven't even gotten into the gathering part, right? This is just a summation. It's a beautiful way to encapsulate our sermon from last week and everything that we talked about with the gospel. We have full assurance of faith because of what Jesus has done, not because of anything that we've done, right? He sacrificed himself for us. He took our place. And that's what the sacrifice would symbolize in the Old Testament, using some of these allusions in this language. You know, it's reminding us, it's a hyperlink back to all of this in the Old Testament to remind us that they would sacrifice unblemished, seemingly perfect, innocent animals, right? And those animals would symbolically take on sin for people. And then when they were killed, it was killed in the place of the person. Symbolically, sin deserves death. Rebellion against the God who provides eternal life deserves eternal death. And so this would symbolize that you kill the animal would die in the place of the person for their sins, so to speak, symbolically. And it was pointing Israel to a day when there would be a greater and truer sacrifice that would come. God would send this greater, this is what the author of Hebrews is saying. He's saying, God sent a better, truer sacrifice, a great high priest, he says here, who wouldn't just advocate on behalf of God's people and offer it like a generic sacrifice for sin, but he would become the very sacrifice for sin on their behalf. This great high priest who wouldn't just advocate, he became sin for God's people to cover them from all of their rebellion and rejection of God. He brought them near through his own sacrifice. He wouldn't just go into the sanctuary as a mediator for us. He would bring us into the sanctuary of God's very presence. You remember in the temple, that's what it looked like. There were all these different layers, and there was the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary where God's presence was supposed to dwell with his people. And nobody could go in except for the high priest once a year to offer a sacrifice, and they'd have to tie a rope around his waist in case he had a wrong motivation and died on the spot in God's presence so that they could pull him out and nobody else would die. That's what it looked like in the sanctuary with God's presence. And so Jesus has torn the curtain through his body on the cross. He's torn the curtain in two so that we could go right in and be in God's presence because of him and his sacrifice on our behalf. Man, if you don't know all that Old Testament stuff, you ought to go back and read some of it. It's very beautiful when you start to see how Jesus fulfills all of that. And then the author of Hebrews says, there's no guilt or shame left for us in that. We're sprinkled clean from an evil conscience. We don't have to have guilt and shame in our lives anymore. We've been washed in pure water, he says here, which is an allusion to baptism as well. And then in response to the gospel of God's love, there are two main imperatives that he gives. He says, draw near and hold on. Draw near to God with full assurance that he has accepted you because of what Jesus has done, not because of anything you could ever do. And then hold on to that faith. Hold on to it. Hold on to the gospel without wavering, knowing that God is the one you can trust. He's the one that's faithful, even when we're not faithful to him. He's still always faithful, so we can draw near and hold on. And the question, though, that we're left with after he says that here in this text is how? How do we hold on? How do we draw near? What does it look like to do that? And then he says in verse 24, this is where it gets to the gathering. He says, and let us consider one another in order to provoke love and good works, not neglecting to gather, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging each other. And all the more as you see the day approaching. Again, an allusion to the day when Jesus is going to come back and restore all things, that day that gives us the hope that we have as Christians. And he gives two more imperatives in this text, doesn't he? If you want to draw near, you want to hold on, which is a vertical kind of thing between us and God, right? Then you need to do two things. Consider one another in order to provoke to love and good works, and then encourage one another through gathering together regularly. So provoke and encourage. Those are the two things we're to do here coming out of there, which are horizontal, right? They affect the vertical. That's what he's saying here. The horizontal is how we mature in the vertical. It's pretty straightforward. If you want to grow in spiritual maturity in a vertical way with God, drawing near, holding on, then you got to grow in your horizontal so that you can provoke and encourage one another in these ways. In short, what we've said today is our main point is we must gather with other believers. That's what he's saying here. We gather together. This doesn't only mean formal gatherings, of course, like what we're doing right now, but it certainly doesn't mean less than that. It certainly doesn't mean less. These gatherings are the floor, we might say. They're not the ceiling. They're not the end goal. They're just the beginning of what this looks like for us in relationships. It's where we can start provoking and start encouraging one another. And gathering together weekly is the baseline here. It was the baseline for the early church. They gathered together in the temple, but then they also got together in homes. And they started to give to one another, and they did life together, as we might say here. And so this is the beginning for the early church, and so it's where we want to begin as well as a church. And I want to point out three characteristics now of these more formal gatherings that they would have that we learn both from Acts chapter 2 and here in Hebrews 10. What were these gatherings like for them? And then let's apply them to us. What does that mean for us as we gather? Okay, so the first characteristic that I have, we're going to do three. Here's the first one for today. Gatherings have structure. Gatherings have structure. Now, I've used the word formal several times here to describe them because they're larger gatherings. They need to have order. And we see that they have order here. The larger gatherings had some kind of structure to them. They weren't just informal, organic things that people got together and hung out, although that happened, right? It says it right there in Acts chapter 2. But these are different than that. These larger gatherings have a structure. They have an order. 1 Corinthians 14, Paul talks about orderly worship gatherings. He actually gives suggestions for how to order your gatherings together. So there's order here. It's inherent in what it means to gather a larger crowd. That's what structure does. Structure provides order, right? And so in Acts chapter 2, they studied the apostles' teaching. That's a specific thing that they structured into their time with one another. They broke bread together, which again we said is an allusion to communion, or some translations even say the Lord's Supper or communion, which means they practiced a symbol. They did something formally together on purpose, right? With intentionality, structure. They baptized together. We saw that happen last week. We talked about it with Peter when they baptized people who were new in the faith, right? They were new. They believed, and then they were baptized right on the spot, right there as people gathered. Many repented and turned to Jesus, were baptized, and then they prayed together. That's an intentional thing they structured into their time. The very word used here in verse 25 for gathering is the term where we get the term synagogue from in Greek. So it literally means in Greek to assemble, to gather. So it's not just the informal doing life together. Again, although that happened, and we'll talk about it next week. But what it is a formal way that they structured time to actually worship God intentionally, to provoke and encourage one another intentionally with these structured elements to their time with one another, structure and order. So that means for us, if that's what it looked like for them and they ordered their time and structured their time together, then for us, our gatherings have a structure and an order. That's what we want to do the same thing. Now, there's no hard and fast rule here. As we see the church progress over time, there's different ways that people begin to structure their gatherings. And you know what? That's totally okay. And I think that's fine. People look in and say, I wish there weren't so many different denominations. I wish there weren't so many different ways of worshiping God. There's one way, there's one church. And you know what? I totally agree with that, and I understand. But as long as we can have an attitude of saying, you know what, God actually gets glorified in the diversity of people worshiping him in different ways. As long as we can have an attitude of saying, you know what, I might disagree with the way somebody does communion. I might disagree with the way somebody does baptism. I might disagree with the way they structure their time. But you know what, that's okay. It's all right. God reaches different people with different sensibilities and different ways of interpreting these things about church. That's not a first-tier issue. That's not a gospel issue, right? It's a second or a third-tier thing where we're like, you know what, we can hold some of those things with open hands. We're going to do a certain way here, but others might do it different ways. As long as we have that attitude of unity in the gospel, it doesn't matter, right? At the end of the day. So there's no hard and fast rule here, but generally, the way that we structure our times is based off of what we see here in Acts chapter 2. We want to devote ourselves to the apostles' teaching. That's why we center our time on the preaching of the gospel like this, you know? We want to make sure that we sing and worship God, you know, and do the things that he's called us to do in the Psalms with one another. We want to make sure that we pray together. We want to make sure that we take communion together like he said that they did in the early church. And at times like today, we want to make sure we baptize together, right? Man, I'm super pumped about that. And of course, we want to have fellowship with one another during these times as well. And, you know, on some special occasions, like the worship night that we're going to have here in almost a month now, man, that's a special extra time. We want to have extra fellowship, extra time of worship, you know? We come in and we do that. Like last week, we had Rookies ice cream here. We had yard games out there. We just hung around and hung out with one another. That's one reason why we provide coffee. You know, everybody's like, oh, coffee, that's so, you know, consumerist. No. It's so that you guys hang out. You want to come early and get together and have fellowship with one another. Everything that we do, I promise you, we have a reason for. It's not just because we're trying to be cool. It's because we're trying to promote these values. And so I want you to be able to see that. That's why we do what we do here. Again, there's no hard and fast rule on how the gathering should be structured, but generally, the gatherings had structure, okay? Second characteristic, gatherings have a rhythm. So they have structure, but they have a rhythm. We saw in Acts chapter 2, they gathered daily. You guys you ready to do this every single day? That's a little bit of, that's a commitment level right there, right? Maybe we'll think about doing that next year. Okay, we'll talk about it as elders, and we'll let you know how we come out on that. Maybe an everyday kind of thing. No, right? I mean, eventually we see it probably just became untenable for them, and so eventually we see even in the Bible those gatherings moved to a more weekly rhythm. These larger gatherings, they still got together in homes and did stuff with did life with one another. They were in community with one another, but we see that they moved to a more weekly rhythm. I'll give you one example. Acts chapter 20, verse 7. They started meeting specifically on Sundays to celebrate Jesus' resurrection on the third day or on the first day of the week. So they were still observing the Sabbath on Saturdays. Remember, most of them were Jewish. That didn't replace, Sundays didn't replace the Sabbath. They were celebrating the Sabbath, resting on Saturdays, and then on Sundays they gathered together to meet and worship God in these more formal kind of assemblies. So they would gather for worship and teaching of the apostles and prayer and all of this stuff. I won't read the whole story from Acts chapter 20. You can go back and put your finger there or make a note and read it yourself this week. But it's when Paul met with the Christians that were in Troas, and he talked so long into the evening that a boy, Eutychus, actually fell out of the window because he fell asleep. I don't know if you remember the story. I've never talked that long, so you're welcome, okay? I mean, Paul talked until it was like dark at night. He started in the day, and he went for hours, and he was teaching, and Eutychus couldn't take it anymore, so he fell out of the window, third floor window. And he hits the ground, and of course, thankfully, there was an apostle there, so Paul goes, and he heals him, and it's totally okay. Paul's like, he's okay, he's okay, he's up, he's okay, right? So he gets him up. But that's what happened there. They were meeting on a Sunday, weekly rhythm we see. So Luke, if you see it in his gospel, he recorded that they met on a Sunday and they worshiped in that gathering and they broke bread. They had communion with one another in that gathering. They had fellowship in that gathering. They listened to Paul teach for hours in that gathering. So it was a more formal, it had some structure to it that Luke records. So it had structure and it had a weekly rhythm. They were there on Sunday. And then, of course, we know that Sundays remained that kind of weekly rhythm for the church for the next 2,000 years. I mean, that's one reason why we still meet on Sundays, to commemorate Jesus' resurrection. We see it throughout church history. So for us, what that means is we're going to gather weekly as well. And in general, we're going to do it on Sundays. So if you want to write that down for us, that's what we're going to do. We're going to generally meet every week on Sundays. And I say generally, because again, don't think this is a hard and fast rule. I don't think it's a religious rule that we have to gather on Sundays. And I don't think it means that Christians have to meet every Sunday or else they're in sin if they don't show up to a gathering, right? That's not what I'm saying, and that's where maybe some of that baggage comes from, where you feel like leaders of the church are manipulating you. And that's not what's going on here, and that's not what I'm saying. It's not what the Bible says. That kind of thinking, I think, would be a misapplication of the fourth commandment to set apart the Sabbath day and keep it holy, to observe the Sabbath day. Because the Sabbath is much less about gathering, because remember, they gathered on Sundays and they Sabbathed on Saturdays. So I don't think the two are correlated. What Sabbath is about is resting in God and what he's done for us. So yeah, I think you ought to take a rest. I think you ought to take a break every week. There ought to be a day, a 24-hour period where you don't do any work. But that's a little separate here. Maybe it's on Sundays for you now because you're able to do that. It's not for me. This is a work day for me, okay? I'm here working. I love my job and I love to do this work, but it's still work, right? So I can't Sabbath on Sundays, but maybe you can. So I don't know what it looks like for you, but I don't think that that's the rule, the hard and fast rule here, that it has to be on Sundays. So we have to guard against this kind of legalism or religiosity in applying this. So there's sometimes circumstances that might keep us from meeting on occasion, you know? And it might warrant changing a day of the week sometimes, every once in a while. The biggest example was COVID, right? We just came out of a season where we couldn't meet on Sundays for the sake of safety. And if I don't care where you fall, I know it drudges up the old feelings. Just put that away, okay? This is not what I'm talking about. I mean, everybody didn't meet for at least one Sunday, okay? Even John MacArthur's church, all right? So I'm just telling you, it happened, okay? All right? So we might do that every once in a while. I don't think that's a bad thing. Now, if it becomes a habit, that's when it becomes a problem, right? Yeah, we're just not going to meet today because we don't feel like it. Oh, man, we're so afraid of this thing over here. We can't keep meeting. You know, if it's a habit, then it becomes a problem. So we did that temporarily during COVID, for example, or traditionally our church has always recognized what we might call shut-ins. You know, there are people that can't come to the gathering. They just can't make it because of mobility reasons or because of health reasons. You know, and if that's you and you're listening, you would automatically either be watching this online or listening to this, and we haven't met you. I want you to make sure that you reach out to us because we would love to help you. We would love to be there for you and come to you because that's really what we ought to do with shut-ins, right? They want to be here. They want to gather, but they're just not able to. And so we need to recognize those folks and make sure that we're helping them and gathering with them in homes if we are able to. But then also we might decide to do something like take a Sunday off after Christmas, which is what we've done for the last 2 years, so that we can give our staff and our leaders a break and celebrate the Christmas season and the new year with our families. And that's totally okay. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Or we might take a Sunday and move it to a different day of the week, like what we might do with Christmas this year. No promises to TBD, okay? We may do that. Instead of worshiping on Sunday, we might back it up and worship during the middle of the week or something like that. Or if we have to miss a Sunday for snow or something, you know, you see what I'm saying though, right? Like it's not a hard and fast rule, okay? It's not a religious rule, but we have a real desire to keep a rhythm of meeting with one another intentionally. I think the big guiding principle is found in verse 25. It says, not neglecting to gather together as are in the habit of doing. Some are in the habit of doing, right? What's the habit? That's the question. What does habit mean here? What's he mean? What's the author mean when he says habit? What constitutes a habit of neglecting the meeting and the gathering? Well, of course, he doesn't define it for us. That'd be too easy, right? Okay, so it would be too easy because maybe we would take it as a hard and fast rule. And so we have to look in at this and say, well, what is he talking about with a habit? And I think that just becomes a subjective thing for each of us or each of us individually as local bodies of believers. What does it mean to have a habit? Christian wisdom, you know, Christian conscience. We go to Romans 14 and say this is left up to our individual conscience perhaps as to what this means. But my provocation to you, if I could use the language from Hebrews here, my provocation to you, my spurring, if I could spur you on here for a second as your pastor, will be to say, I think you ought to make it a personal habit, a personal rhythm of your life to gather as often as you're able to. I think that's what he's saying here. Because when you get in a habit, it's something that you're intentionally doing over time, over and over and over again, right? My provocation to you, my encouragement to you is to make it a priority for yourself. If you want to spiritually mature, that's the whole point. If you're okay with never growing spiritually, then don't worry about it, right? But if you want to grow in your relationship with God and deeper into the gospel, and you want to understand more and more this idea that you don't have to be guilty, that he's done it all for you, then be here every week as much as you can, as much as you're able to, right? Don't make it a habit to not. Since the pandemic, only about 85% of people who are in church have come back on a regular basis, and most of those people consider a regular basis as once a month. It's about 40% of churchgoers. They say if they're here once a month, then that's regular for them. Only 20% of churchgoers say they attend every week. Guys, coming to church once a month is not regular. I just want to tell you that. Just as your pastor, I love you. I'm not trying to be ugly. That's not regular. If you don't come to church more than you do come to church, you've created a habit of neglecting. That's what's happened in your life. It's like working out once a month. I mean, you can do it, but it's kind of like, what's the point? Working out is supposed to help you build muscle and create stamina and give you health in your body. And you do that once a month. I guess it's better than not ever doing it, maybe. Kind of, right? Although you could hurt yourself, so maybe it's more dangerous. You right? That's exactly what it's like coming to church, because you come into church, you come here for yourself, you think you're going to get filled up, and then somebody ends up hurting your feelings or something like that. Or I say something that hurts your feelings. I think maybe it's more dangerous if you do that, to just come in every once in a while. I think what you need to do is you need to commit to be here every day for your own health, for your sake. Again, I'm not saying that for me, and I want to be careful when I say it like this. I'm trying to make sure I don't come across in an ugly way when I say this. But I've said it to you guys before. I don't have to do this. I didn't have to be a pastor. I didn't have to lead our church plant here. And again, I want to say that with as much gentleness and humility as I can, because what I'm trying to tell you is I didn't come to build a crowd. Man, if I wanted to do something to make money or something like that or be famous somewhere, I would have done something else. I promise you that, okay? I wouldn't have given a lot of blood, sweat, and tears over the last 3 years to be in here in Roanoke, Virginia in the middle of a pandemic when we launched. I promise you, I would have done something else. I'm saying it for you. I'm saying it so that you'll grow. I want this for you so badly so that you understand that it is important for you to be around other Christians. Some of you guys have heard my story, Tamara and I's story in this. We started going to church when we first got married and moved down to Raleigh-Durham area. We started going to the church of the Summit Church because the first Sunday we walked in, we had to sit out in the lobby and watch him up on a TV screen because it was so jammed. It's even hotter than it was in here right now, okay? It's even hotter because there were so many bodies and there was standing room only. So we had to sit out in the lobby. People wanted to be there and gather. They were so excited to be there to hear the gospel preached. They were so excited to be there to worship God, and that was contagious for us. And we wanted that. We wanted to be there with them. And so that changed the way that we looked at church forever, really. It was life-changing for us. And so if you want to be poured into with the gospel here, and you want to build authentic community, and you want to get mobilized to go live on mission and have a purpose in your life other than just the American dream or whatever else you try to come up with, then be here, man. Be here. Lead your family to be here. Do that because it's what's best for you. You'll grow. So guys, I'm just saying it out of personal conviction, all right? And because what the Bible is teaching us, the Bible, if it's not enough to just hear my story about it, the Bible is telling us we ought to do this. Gathering has to have a rhythm, and you need to commit yourself to that rhythm as best you can. And the last characteristic I want to point out for today is this. Okay, gatherings have a purpose. Gatherings have a purpose. They have a structure, they have a rhythm, but they have a purpose. And when the early church met, it was certainly to worship God. Okay, no doubt. We see that happening in the meeting there in Acts chapter 2, or even there's an allusion to it in Hebrews. They're meditating on the gospel, right? That's the whole idea. They're worshiping God for what he's done in their lives. But listen, all of our life should be worship. And we're going to actually have a sermon series on this later on in the fall, deep dependent worship. That's all of life. We should be worshiping God every day in everything that we do, including when we gather. Listen, what they're saying in both Acts chapter 2 and Hebrews 10 is that we ought to gather together for the sake of being together to worship God. You can worship God in your car, man. Do that. You should worship God in meditating on Scripture every day in the morning like we talked about last week. You should worship God in everything you do. But we come here to do it together, right? There's something inherent. It's a team sport. We're supposed to be doing this together. That's why Hebrews 10 shows us it's ultimately for provoking and encouraging, he says here. If he wanted to say that it was for the express purpose of just worshiping God, then he would have said that, but he didn't. He said what you need to do is you need to get together and provoke and encourage one another to love and good works. That's what it said. I'll throw it back up on the screen for you. Consider one another in order to provoke love and good works. Love and good works, what's that mean? Well, considering one another means we're thinking about each other when we gather together. We're thinking about how to help one another grow, to provoke and to encourage. What's provoking to love who? And encouraging to love who? God, right? But then also one another. It's the greatest commandment. It's the great commandment to love God and love each other. That's what we're provoking one another. That's what we're encouraging one another to do. Here, the word provoke literally means to irritate. So we're to irritate one another, all right? And some of you guys are like, yeah, I know a lot of Christians who are like that, okay? I know some Christians who are irritating, okay? It's not like that. It's not supposed to be nagging irritation. It's supposed to be spurring or goading. Some of your translations might even say spur or goad, right? If you think about what spurs are in horseback riding, they're to irritate the horse to get it to go the direction you want it to go. Now, I'm not a horseback rider, so I don't know if you do one side to go right, or I don't know how that works. You can talk to somebody who knows that. But yeah, it's not to hurt the horse. It's not to mortally wound the horse, right? It's not to just irritate the horse for no reason. It's to get him to go in the direction that he needs to go. We're to irritate one another for that purpose. We're to confront one another. We're to help correct one another. We're to irritate, to provoke, to spur on in order to get each other in the right direction of following Jesus, right? This is a great example of this. If you remember the Odyssey, you know, the story, the old story, the ancient story, the Odyssey with Odysseus. One of the points in the story, Odysseus knows he's about to take the ship of men near the island with all the sirens on it. And, you know, sirens are those magical, mythical creatures that they look like beautiful women, and they have beautiful voices, and they sing, and they lure in the sailors so that the sailors will come crash up against the rocks and die, basically. You know, and so he knows that they're getting close to that, and so what he does is he tells all of his men on the ship to put wax in their ears so they can't hear anything, and he'll be on the mast, and they'll tie him to the mast so that he can't dive off or jump off the boat. And he said, when we get close, you'll know, because I'll start to lose my mind. And then when we get further away, you'll know, because I start to come back to my senses, and I'll be the test for that. I'll be the one. And so they do this, they tie him to the mast, and he starts to lose it. He says, now, no matter what I say during this time, you cannot let me go. You cannot let me have what I want. I'm going to want to go after these things. You're going to have to keep me tied up. Don't listen until you know I come back to my senses. That's a perfect example of what God tells us to do in the church with one another. He invites his sailors into radical accountability in his life, basically. Give me what I need, not what I want. That's what we ought to be doing with one another. We ought to be irritating one another in that way, letting people and inviting people to do that in our lives. Say, man, don't give me what I need. Give me, that's our natural heart, right? Don't give me what I need. Give me what I want. Come on. Now, we should be telling people, hey, listen, don't give me what I want. Give me what I need in the gospel. Give me the gospel. I'm going to want to go after these things. My heart is bent toward these things in my life. Give me what I need. Tell me when I'm getting off track. Show me, help me, spur me on, goad me in the right direction. And so, to put it in Hebrews language, for us as a church, our gatherings here will provoke and encourage. If I could bring it all back down to what we're doing here with the gatherings, we'll talk more about the community next week and what it looks like to do life together and help one another in those ways, one-on-one or in smaller groups. But right now, let's talk about the gathering. Our gatherings will provoke and encourage, hopefully, because we need that radical accountability in our lives. We need people who we trust to do both of those things for us. Provocation is kind of like the negative side of that, right? Spurring, goading. It's helping us, confronting, right? It's kind of the negative side of that. But then we're also to encourage one another, which is the positive side of that. We're to do both of those things. I hope that we do that in the preaching every week. That's what this time is meant to do for you, is to help correct, maybe confront, but it's also to encourage, man, the gospel. You can't do anything. God's done it all for you, right? There's encouragement here. There's both of these things. So gatherings should do both. We're going to make space in our structure and our rhythms for doing that together. And it's going to happen through the preaching, but it's also going to happen through the fellowship that we have and the worship songs that we have, prayer time where you have time to respond, like what we're going to do here in just a few minutes, where you come to the table of communion and you respond to God and have personal time with him. All of these things add up to provocation and encouragement. And if you don't feel like that's happening for you in these meetings, if you come to a gathering and you don't feel like that's happening for you, let me be gentle and spur you on here. Let me confront just as gently as I can. Maybe you need to stop dashing out the door right as we end and leave and getting in your car and leaving. Maybe you need to stop showing up 10 minutes late. Sorry, I know that stuff's on some people's toes because I saw you walking in, okay? I saw you. It's okay. There's no judgment here, okay? Jesus has done everything necessary for you. There's no guilt, there's no shame. But, hey man, we're confronted. That's the whole point. We can be confronted because he's taken all of our guilt and shame. We don't have to take it that way. And we can take it in a way that corrects us and helps us follow him more. There's no guilt and shame for you. But just listen, I mean, if this is not happening for you, either A, maybe you don't believe the gospel yet, or B, you need to be around a little bit more. Get to know some people. Introduce yourself. Because I'll tell you what, if somebody didn't say hi to you on the way in here, we're firing people, okay? Because we try to make sure that you feel super welcomed and give you ways to connect with the body of believers. So make sure that you're doing that intentionally on your own part. Because there's purpose to the gathering. And it's to provoke and it's to encourage, and we have access to God. Full assurance of faith. We can draw near to him, we can hold on to that. But how? When we gather with other believers and we provoke and encourage one another to love and good works that are in the gospel. C.S. Lewis, writing in Mere Christianity, said that Christ works on us in all sorts of ways, but above all, he works on us through one another. It starts with gathering together and being around other Christians. So what I want to leave you with today by way of application is just this one simple thing. Attend and serve at the weekly gathering. Do those things, and I promise you'll start to grow in spiritual maturity. We have testimony of people who've experienced that, including, again, my own testimony. Just attend and serve, and you'll start to see God work in ways that you weren't sure was even possible. Attend and be present so that you can be poured into and provoked and encouraged. And then serve so that you can provoke and encourage one another and allow others that same kind of experience that you've had as well. Right? We want to serve one another in that way. Give each other the opportunity to do these kinds of things. Welcome people in. The best way to start this whole process is by going to Starting Point with us. I won't belabor it since Caitlin mentioned it in our announcement time. But man, sign up for Starting Point. If you're not connected to a local body, we would love to have you connected here. And we say this all the time, we're a church for anyone. We want to be a church for anyone, and maybe we're not the church for everyone, and that's okay too, right? There are differences in the way people do things, that's totally fine, but you come to Starting Point and you'll figure that out, because we're going to tell you about who we are and how you can fit into the mission with us here. So I would encourage you to sign up for that and be present there. But just remember how welcomed you felt when you came in here, hopefully. It started by coming to the gathering on Sundays, right? We want to continue that same feeling for other people, because our gathering is an important part of spiritual growth in our lives. So let's make sure that we make it a habit. We have some structure to our lives. We have some rhythm to come here weekly. And we come here with the purpose of provoking and encouraging one another in those ways. Let me pray for us. God, thanks so much for listening with us today. We hope that it was an encouragement to you. But you know, we don't see this as a replacement for gathering with other believers in a local church context. And so if you don't have a local church, we would encourage you to plug in with one wherever you are. And if you're in Roanoke, Virginia, we'd love to invite you to plug in with us here at Redemption Church. And you're welcome anytime to gather with us. But you can check us out online at our website, redemptionroanoke.com. You can look for other content or resources there. But thanks again for listening.